Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Summer Sherland, and today we're going to ask ourselves the question, did slavery cause the U.S. Civil War? And this lecture is a partial review of an article written in tandem with Mark G. Malvasi and Carrie M. Roberts. All right, you should see my screen. Did slavery cause the Civil War? Why this question? Why would we ask ourselves this question in the 21st century? It seems so obvious, doesn't it? That we would just assume we know the answer. I think in particular, those of us living in the West, we just assume that yes, slavery caused the Civil War and that's the answer. However, this is a very political and divisive question. It's a question that is still debated today and oftentimes debated with inaccuracies or misinformation. So even though we are hundreds of years past this, or 100 and some years past the Civil War, we really should continue to probe this question so that we are prepared for some of those inaccuracies that might come at us with regard to the question of the central issue of the Civil War. And significantly as well, historians continually debate this question, and they don't necessarily debunk the narrative that the Civil War was in fact fought over the conditions and the central tenets of slavery, but they look at kind of the parameters, they look at the parameters around slavery and how it influenced the United States and how it influenced ultimately the Confederacy, and how those conditions led to the Civil War. So it's a really complex question. It seems obvious, but it's a little bit more complex than we might assume. So in today's discussion, my hope is that through the writing of Malvasi and Carrie, you'll be able to see that there are a couple different ways of looking at this question, but that you'll ultimately come to kind of a central answer. But let's begin with just some general facts about the US Civil War. Fact number one, the Civil War was fought between the northern and southern states from 1861 to 1865. South Carolina prepared its paperwork to secede from the Union before the election of Abraham Lincoln. But once Abraham Lincoln was elected to the United States presidency, South Carolina announced it was seceding, meaning it was leaving the Union, leaving Congress, leaving all political connections behind, and that they were starting their own country. So fact number two, Abraham Lincoln was president of the United States during the Civil War. Now, Lincoln and his fellow Northerners believed themselves to be the leaders of an entire country, including the South. So when South Carolina seceded, Lincoln didn't necessarily go to war with the South. He went to war on behalf of the entire country to reclaim the South, to kind of stop the South from seceding. So he never saw himself as the president of the North. He saw himself as the president of the entire Union, despite the fact that the Southern states seceded or left the Union. Fact number three, the issues of slavery and central power divided the United States. So slavery was the central issue, but this question of central power, it means federal power, federal oversight, meaning kind of the central authority of Washington, Congress, the presidency, etc., versus the distribution of power among the states. This becomes a significantly complex and heated issue. The states' authority to rule themselves. It's interesting because in the 21st century, we actually see these same conflicts burning through political and media type discourse about the role of the central government versus the role of states governments versus the role of local governments, cities, counties, things like that. But regardless of that discussion of central authority or central power, the ultimate issue that was being debated, much like in 2021, a big discussion was like masks in schools or mandated vaccines, for example. Well, a lot of times people were discussing like states' rights or local oversight or authority, but the central issue had to do with COVID-19. It's kind of similar, but even more exacerbated, that the states were advocating, especially the southern states, were advocating for more localized control and governmental oversight of their own states and local constituents. But the real issues at the center of all this had to do with the role of slavery. Fact number four, the Civil War began when Southern troops bombarded Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Fact number 5, this is interesting. The North had more manpower, meaning more military organization and war materials than the South. And they kind of were poised to be more successful, but it was not an easy fight for the North or the South. Fact number 6, the bloodiest battle of the entire Civil War was the Battle of Gettysburg, which took place in the North in Pennsylvania. Fact number 7, Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee did not meet on the battlefield until May of 1864, near the end of the war. Fact number 8, this is indisputed, the North won the Civil War. Fact number 9, when the war was over, the Constitution of the United States was amended to free the slaves, to assure, quote, equal protection under the law for American citizens, and to grant Black men the right to vote. This was the first time that the word men was included in the Constitution to delineate or distinguish who could vote. It was all white and Black men. And fact number 10, as I mentioned, the cause of the Civil War is still debated, but it doesn't need to be. It's pretty clear. You can debate the realities and the conditions and the different ways that slavery was debated, but really the central role of slavery is pretty key and pretty elemental to understanding the Civil War. Now, if you would like to have more information on the Civil War, you should check out Untitled Chapter. There's also an article called where I got this information, 10 Facts What Everyone Should Know About the Civil War, and that's on the website American Battlefield Trust. That's battlefields.org. A few more facts about the Civil War before we kind of debate the central issue of slavery. It was fought from 1861 to 1865. It resulted in approximately 750,000 deaths. It was the bloodiest war in American history. Most Northern soldiers went to war to preserve the Union, but ultimately the war transformed into a struggle to eradicate slavery. And I'm going to show you kind of through the words of Abraham Lincoln, how the initial cause of the war was to protect the Union, to keep the Union and the United States intact, but it sort of evolved over time to really debate the merits of slavery. Most Southern soldiers, on the other hand, went to war to protect slavery. African Americans, both enslaved and free, pressed for the issue of emancipation. Women thrust themselves into wartime roles while navigating a world without men of military age, especially in the North. The Civil War was a defining event for the United States, and it has continued to shape our current world. So let's talk about some of those central issues leading up to the Civil War. The first and foremost was slavery. And in fact, I'm going to show you about 4 more central issues, but slavery is going to be at the heart of all of them. The role of slavery in the United States. You'll remember from a few weeks ago, the North was implicated in slavery just as much as the South. Slaves were active in the South. The enslaved people were the ones providing the majority of the labor in the South, and the South was incredibly wealthy as a result of King Cotton. But the North became wealthy as well because they were the ones processing, manufacturing, and ultimately trading the cotton, which was grown and materialized on the backs of human labor. Another key component that led to the Civil War was the expansion of slavery. You can see on the bottom of this map, slavery was starting to move west, really, and yet you have the inclusion of Oregon and California as free or non-slave holding states, and the issue of how to balance out the power in the South and the North, slave holding South, non-slave holding North, that continued to be an issue in Congress. The Compromise of 1850 and all of those agreements that were included, including the Fugitive Slave Law, or the Fugitive Slave Act, those were all contributors to the US Civil War. And that same thing I mentioned, the distinction between federal government versus state authority. So some states wanted more claim or ownership over their own choices than they wanted to allow the federal government to have. But the thing that they all wanted more control over had to do with the issue of slavery. So here are some motivations, or just, some distinctions and motivations. The Confederates on the South argued that they were fighting for the right to secession. They were fighting for the right to secede and become their own independent nation. Unionists, on the other hand, believed they were fighting to prevent Southerners from dismantling the United States. So you can see how the paradigm is very different. On the South, you have people trying to say that it's our right as Americans to be our own country. We want to kind of be under the Articles of Confederation law, or that way of looking at it, that we're our own country. We can establish our own treaties and our own ways of life. But on the other side, on the North, the Unionists are saying, no, we're all bound by the same Constitution. We're one country, we're one nation. So here's a difference in leadership approaches. On the left, you have Lincoln, who is the leader of the Union, the leader of the entire United States, and is most significantly a Northerner. I think it's a really important quote because so often you're going to get quotes from Lincoln that are from the Emancipation Proclamation or the Gettysburg Address. And I think it's important to see that early on in the Civil War, Lincoln didn't have, he was morally opposed to slavery, but he didn't have a public address about the merits of slavery or the central tenets of slavery. You can see instead on the left side, he actually sort of argues that he's not making slavery his central problem. He says, my paramount objective in this struggle is to save the Union and is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps save the Union. So that's early on, that's 1862, the war goes until 1865, but this is Lincoln's early claims on the future of sort of slavery and his role as the protector of the Union. Meanwhile, in the South, you have Jefferson Davis, who's the president of the Confederacy. He has a completely different approach to this. He says, quote, let the gentleman go to Revelation, that's a book in the Bible, to learn the decree of God. Let him go to the Bible. I said that slavery was sanctioned in the Bible, authorized, regulated, and recognized from Genesis to Revelation. Slavery existed then in the earliest ages and among the chosen people of God. And in Revelation, we are told that it shall exist until the end of time shall come. You find it in the Old and New Testaments, in the prophecies, Psalms, and the epistles of Paul. You find it recognized and sanctioned everywhere. This was also around 1862. I couldn't find a specific date for this quote, but I'm imagining it's circa 1862. So you can see on the one hand, Lincoln has the moral obligation of the North to protect the Union, whereas Jefferson Davis believes that he has the moral obligation or the decree from God to protect the future of slavery itself, the institution of slavery. So it's less about the politics, it's less about the landscape and the geography of the South versus the North, and more about the institution of slavery as a moral decree from the Bible, as far back as the Bible. I want to speak quickly to you about the constitutions that were governing both of these entities. The United States was governed by the Constitution, and you remember the Constitution is that which defines the role of the government, right? The Bill of Rights is what protects the individual from the government or defines the role of the citizen, whereas the Constitution defines the role of the government. There's three branches. Everyone at this time is under the Constitution in the eyes of the North. Even though the South has seceded, the North still claims that all of the Southern states are still governed by the Constitution. Meanwhile, in the South, the Confederacy has written their own Constitution. And in fact, historians have discovered that though the Confederacy wrote their own Constitution, claiming that they were most interested in states' rights and states' authority, really the very few changes that the South made to the overall Constitution governing the entire country when they wrote the Constitution of the Confederacy had to do with slavery. Those are the only real significant changes between the United States Constitution and the Confederacy's Constitution. So here's an example. At first glance, much of the Confederate document that they wrote came directly from the United States Constitution. Now, there are some differences. But there were several passages related to slavery that were much different. So they actually only significantly changed the Constitution of the United States when it came to amending anything that had to do with slavery. The Confederate version used the words slaves, unlike the United States Constitution, which left the word slave out completely. One article of the Confederacy banned any Confederate state from making slavery illegal. Another ensured that slave owners could travel between Confederate states with their slaves. The Confederate Constitution also accounted for slaves as 3/5 of a state's population, like the United States Constitution did at the time, and it required that any new territory acquired by the nation would allow slavery. So you can see how that kind of is a reaction to the Missouri Compromises and the Compromise of 1850. In other ways, the Confederate Constitution was closer to the Articles of Confederation, which, as you know, preceded the United States Constitution because it focused on states' rights and tried to limit federal power in many ways, but all with regard to one issue. So I want you to pause the recording right now and just respond to this question for the course of 1 minute. In your opinion, was slavery the central cause of the Civil War? Why or why not? Go ahead and pause, write your answer. I'm not going to review it, just write it down, and we'll come back and discuss. Okay, what did you write? In your opinion, was slavery the central cause of the United States Civil War? Why or why not? Now, my favorite thing to do when it comes to research is to establish a hypothesis, just like you did. You just wrote based on whatever you've read or whatever you've heard from me, what you think. Well, now you're going to fill out your explanation or your beliefs a little bit more, and here's how. You should have access either by way of link or in class to an article called U.S. Civil War, Did Slavery Cause the Civil War? And it's written by Mark G. Malvasi and Carrie M. Roberts. So Roberts and Malvasi kind of dispute the role of slavery through this 6-page article. And they have a couple different viewpoints. So you've got the introduction here. Then you have viewpoint 1, right? Yes, slavery was the essential issue that divided the South from the North. That's viewpoint 1. Then you have viewpoint 2. No. Slavery was only one cause of the Civil War. A variety of political, economic, social, and cultural factors contributed to the conflict. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to pause the recording again, actually stop it, and read the opposing viewpoint from your own. So the viewpoint that's different from your own. For instance, did you write that yes, slavery caused the Civil War? If so, then only read the section titled Viewpoint No. Slavery was only one cause of the Civil War, and that's written by Roberts. If you wrote that no, slavery was not the cause, then read only the section titled Viewpoint Yes, slavery was the essential issue. I want you to pause and read those. And then when you're done, come back to this exit ticket short paper. Now that you've read the opposing viewpoint, and you can go and look into the one that agrees with you, but read the opposing one first. How has your opinion changed or been affected? Maybe it's been changed. Maybe your opinion has been even more defended based on the opposing viewpoint. Provide some examples from the reading. I look forward to hearing what you have to say.